Israel-Palestine conflict is very complicated, but in this video, I'm going to go over around 100 years of history and help you get a clear understanding of what exactly is going on in that region. Let's get into it. In 1897, Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland. Herzl was sick of all the hate the Jews got in Europe, so he defined Zionism as the creation of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a place for Jews that would be free of hate. But Palestine wasn't empty. It was already inhabited by some Jews and majority Arab, but to them, Palestine was empty. Palestine at the time was under the Ottoman Empire, and in 1882 there was 24,000 Jews and 276,000 non-Jews. By 1914 there was 94,000 Jews. Jews at the time were immigrating for economic purposes, not religious purposes. So they settled on the coastal plains and valleys, not the religious areas, since it's the mountainous region. Anyways, World War I started in 1914 and ended in 1918, and it would transform the Middle East. Before World War I, there was no Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. It was all under the Ottoman Empire. 4 centuries of Ottoman rule ended, and the area was carved up into states, including Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. European rule was sanctions through the League of Nations mandate system. Through the mandate system, the British were given control over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. The French had Syria and Lebanon. In 1917, in the Balfour Declaration, the British government promised that they would make Palestine a Jewish home. In a letter addressed to Lord Rothschild, British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Of course, the Arab that were the majority there at the time didn't like it. But Palestine at the time had no mechanism of government like a legislative assembly. In Palestine on the Arab side, Arab notable families held power. And of course, the British government played the families against each other to get what they want. Palestinian Arab at the time demanded control over Jewish immigration and land purchase. But the British government demanded the Arab that they should accept the terms of the mandate. The purpose of the League of Nations mandate system was to give British and French control over areas that were formerly under Ottoman Empire, so they could help the people living there, like the people living in Iraq, make a government and then leave, which happened in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, but not Palestine. In 1929, the first large-scale fighting among Arab and Jews happened, when there was already tensions over increasing Jewish immigration. Some Jews tried to extend their access to the Western Wall, an important holy site for both people, but the Arab refused. Violence erupted in 1929 when a group of Jews organized a demonstration at the Western Wall. The violence spread and Jews were massacred in some cities. 133 Jews and 116 Arab lost their lives. The British government couldn't control this revolt, and they were worried about losing control. In 1936, after almost 20 years of British dominance, thousands of Arabs from all classes revolted. Palestine erupted. There was massive demonstrations everywhere, catching everyone off guard: the British government, the Arab notable families, and the Jewish communities, the Yishuv. On the Arab side, the Palestinian noble families came together and formed the Arab Higher Commission, and they called for a strike. But this strike hurt the Arab more than it helped them. They were out of work for months, and the Yishuv, the Jewish community, became more self-reliant. Jewish people just hired more Jewish workers, which accelerated the segregation. The British government sent in over 20,000 troops to end the revolt. The British also established a royal commission chaired by Lord Peel. In 1937, the Peel Commission report was published. It proposed that Palestine should be split into areas under Jewish control and areas under Arab control. The Jews were for the partition and recognizing the Israeli state, but they didn't like this plan. They wanted more land. On the Arab side, they rejected it completely because over 200,000 Arab would have to move from the land of their ancestors to make room for a Jewish state over here. That was unacceptable to the Arab. They also said, why should they accept the poorer parts of Palestinian soil? From 1936 to 1939, there was so much violence, so much destruction of property until the British government, using their troops, put down the revolt. 10% of the Palestinian male population was either killed or wounded. This level of violence made the British government worried, so the British government reversed its commitment to the Jews in the Balfour Declaration and issued a new white paper calling for an independent Palestinian state under majority Arab rule. In 1939, they issued this white paper, which yielded to Arab demands. This white paper restricted immigration. During the next 5 years, only 75,000 Jews would be allowed into the country. After that, it would be up to the Arab. It also limited land transfer to Jews. The British were going to look out for Arab interests, but World War II happened and things got complicated. Palestine became an important military base for Britain, and that forced it to change its policies again. And during the war with Germany, the Jewish community built up its military capabilities significantly. In 1942, they met with the Americans in New York and demanded unrestricted immigration, a Jewish army, and the establishment of Palestine as a Jewish commonwealth. After World War II, because of the Hollow, sympathy for the Jewish refugees was very high, so many countries supported the idea of an independent Jewish state as a home for the refugees. America called for the relaxation of the 1939 White Paper, which limited Jewish immigration to 75 Jews for the next 5 years. After the war, the British government was weak and they needed the Americans to stay as a superpower. So they listened. They withdrew and asked the United Nations for help. It was now in the hands of the United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations set out a plan for Palestine. The plan was to split Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish people would get 55% of the land when there were only 33% of the population. But more Jewish refugees were expected to immigrate. But the Jews only owned 7% of the land. The Arab would get 42% of the land, and they were 67% of the population at the time. It was viewed as very unfair, so after the plan was approved, Arab revolted and violence broke out. Civil war erupted between the Arab and Jews. The British government didn't help the United Nations implement the plan because they had their own goals. They said the ones that voted for it can step up and do something. No one was doing anything, so things went too far. Fighting between Arab and Jews was intense. In 1948, the British left Palestine. On that same day, the State of Israel was declared, instantly recognized by the United States. Right after declaring independence, the armies of Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, and Egypt crossed into Palestine and attacked Israel. The total number of troops by all the Arab armies was around 25,000, not well trained. The IDF, on the other hand, was 35,000. But in 1949, Israel and the Arab countries signed an agreement to end the hostilities. Israel now had 78% of the land. And thanks to secret agreements with Jordan, Jordan got access to the West Bank and Gaza went to Egypt. 6,000 Jewish people died for the independent state of Israel, which was around 1% of the Jewish population at the time. Jewish society started to flourish economically and militarily. And to prevent future attacks, the Israeli government took on the policy of retaliation with disproportionate force. Basically, if you attack us, we attack you 10 times harder. Palestinian society, on the other hand, was destroyed. 750,000 became homeless refugees. The refugees were scattered into Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and 200,000 of them went to Gaza. In 1964, the PLO was formed, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This was a political umbrella organization of several Palestinian groups, not one. Some of these groups were more violent than others. In the 1960s, tensions were high in the Middle East, and Israel was perceived as very powerful. And on May 13, 1967, the Soviet Union provided information that Israel was amassing around 11 brigades to attack Syria. They gave this information to Egypt. So on May 14, 1967, Egyptian forces mobilized in the Sinai. And on May 22, Egypt placed a blockade on Israeli shipping. Then Jordan and Iraq joined forces with Egypt, and in response to the apparent mobilization of its Arab neighbors, on June 5th, Israel staged a sudden, preemptive air assault, destroying more than 90% of Egypt's air force. They also attacked Syria. After 6 days, Israel won and occupied the Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, and part of Syria. Internationally, all this land Israel acquired after the war. The international community expected Israel to swap this land for peace, so the Land for Peace formula was made in United Nations Resolution 242, which called for Israel returning all the land acquired by force through the 1967 conflict and solving the refugee problem. Israel accepted the resolution but said the term territories is not defined, so they said we can keep some of the land we acquired. In August 1967, the Arab leaders met in Khartoum where the 3 no's were made. No peace, no negotiations, and no recognition of Israel. 3 no's. From 1967 to 1979, there was a few attacks by Egypt against Israel that were strategic. And in 1979, after attacks from Egypt, Israel wanted Egypt off its back. So in March 1979, with the help of the American president, Egypt and Israel under Prime Minister Michaim Bichain signed a peace treaty. Israel gave Egypt back the Sinai, and Egypt was done with Palestine. The Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Michaim Bichain, got Egypt out of the way, and now he had more power. To him, the areas of Gaza and West Bank were areas of biblical inheritance to the Jewish people. So he sped up the process of Jewish settlement, and Jewish settlement in the West Bank has been growing since the 1980s. The settlements were strategically located in areas where the Land for Peace model could not work anymore, intentionally making it difficult to negotiate for peace. The PLO, which was the umbrella organization made up of different groups, led by Yasser Arafat, were now working out of Jordan. In 1970, the PFLP, one of the groups under the PLO, they hijacked an aircraft with over 300 people and tried to overthrow the king of Jordan. So the PLO was kicked out of Jordan and they had to move to Lebanon. In 1975, the Lebanese Civil War started. During the Civil War, the Lebanese government became concerned with the PLO being there, and Israel wanted to get rid of the PLO. So in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to destroy the PLO. Israeli forces eventually surrounded the capital of Lebanon and expelled the PLO to Tunisia. In Lebanon, there were refugees that came to Lebanon from Israel in 1948. They were now living in Shatila and Sabra refugee camps. Later, Lebanese Christian military men entered Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. Under the watch of Israeli army, 2,000 to 3,500 people were killed. The refugees there were not armed. The Israeli forces then were led by the defense minister Ariel Sharon. Remember this name. He's going to come up later. He's important. And in 1987, 1947 with the leaders of the PLO now in Africa, after 20 years of unbearable occupation, and when Israel was intensifying settlement construction in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the younger generation of Palestinian Arabs started to take matters into their own hands and revolted against Israel. The revolt started after 4 Palestinians died in a car accident. The protesters included women and children, and when TV channels started showing women and children with rocks against Israeli forces with rifles, those images got international attention. Both the PLO and the Israeli army were surprised by the Intifada, the uprising. The Israeli government responded with brute force to crush the resistance, but failed. It only fueled it more. A new resistance group, Hamas, was born out of the Intifada, and PLO, the organization that was left powerless in Africa, were given a lifeline. They took advantage of the situation, and in 1988, they reaffirmed Resolution 242, recognized Israel as a state, and called for a peaceful settlement in a Palestinian state located in West Bank and Gaza. In 1993, Clinton met with Prime Minister Rabin and Arafat. The PLO and Israel signed the Oslo Accords in 1993, and under this agreement, governing functions in the West Bank and Gaza would be given over to the Palestinian Council over a period of 5 years. Some more complicated issues were left for later negotiations like Jerusalem and the refugee status. They were supposed to be settled by 1999, but there were many problems. Extremist groups from both sides were trying to stop the negotiations for peace, so they were resorting to violence to stop the peace process. Later, Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, the prime minister that was interested in negotiating for peace, was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. Then Benjamin Netanyahu came in and ruined a few things. He didn't like the Oslo Accords. Hamas was also increasing terrorism against Israelis to stop the peace process. During the time of the Oslo Accords, things didn't improve for Palestinian Arab. Israeli settlements kept increasing and land confiscation kept increasing. And during that time, Yasser Arafat was listening to Bibi Netanyahu, so his reputation declined in the eyes of Palestinian Arab. Not much changed by 1999. Less than 1/5 of the West Bank had reverted to full Palestinian control. After Netanyahu, Ehud Barak came in as prime minister, who was more willing to negotiate for peace. The number of Israeli settlements grew, and in the year 2000, Clinton, Arafat, and Barak met. That was the Camp David summit. It failed and ended with anger and frustration on both sides. I don't think there was any written offers, but Arafat rejected the oral offer because it didn't meet his expectations when it comes to Jerusalem and refugee issues. But enough had been accomplished there, so they met again. They met again in December, and this time Clinton had a plan for both of them. Under Clinton's plan, Palestine would build a state on 94% of the occupied territories. He also had a plan for the Palestinian refugees, Jerusalem, and other issues. They were so close to a real peace deal, but it was too late. The second uprising, the second Intifada, ruined everything for them. What started the second Intifada? Besides the misery of occupation and the failed Oslo Accords of 1993, Ariel Sharon, a very controversial guy, the guy from this massacre, toured a holy temple in Jerusalem surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of armed riot police. Some say he came on purpose to start a riot because he was so hated by the Palestinian people. And when he said any Jew can visit this holy site, Palestinians reacted by throwing stones. And they were put down with lethal force by Israeli forces. With 18 people now dead, there was demonstrations, and those demonstrations became a popular uprising. Many people on both sides lost their lives. During the Intifada, political power became even more fragmented. Hamas grew more and PLO lost power. On the Israeli side, they became more concerned about security. So Ariel Sharon became prime minister in 2001. After the events of 9/11 in the United States, George Bush declared a war against terrorism. This was a global war which included Israelis' fight against the Palestinian terrorists now. The US was basically like, you guys are just dealing with your own terrorist, Hamas. So Ariel Sharon's actions were supported by the US. He forgot about negotiations and rejected Arafat as a possible peace partner. His goal was to separate the Israeli from the Palestinian. This policy became known as disengagement. He built walls to prevent terrorists from coming into Israel. In 2005, Ariel Sharon removed 5,000 Jewish settlers from the Gaza Strip, and then he started to deepen his control in the West Bank, increasing Jewish settlements. Hamas took all the credit for the Jews evacuating out of Gaza. The PLO was left powerless. The Israeli government wouldn't listen to them anymore and didn't even want to talk to them anymore. This destroyed the image of the PLO in the eyes of the public. Their credibility went down. So people started to believe that negotiation doesn't work anymore. And in January 2006, there was elections in Gaza, and Hamas won, leaving everyone stunned. Negotiations were now seeming impossible.